Hello, everyone, and welcome to Webinar Wednesday. Today, we're joined by Jeremy Linden, Senior Director, Product Management at Asimily, and Robert Harbick, Information Security Engineer at Southcoast Health. Webinar Wednesday would like to thank our sponsor, Asimily. Founded in late 2017, Asimily has been deployed in more than 1,800 healthcare sites across North America. Asimily's IoMT risk remediation platform holistically secures the mission-critical devices that deliver care. Using Asimily, health delivery organizations can comprehensively monitor and manage devices throughout the entire life cycle, from pre-procurement all the way to decommissioning. We encourage you to learn more about today's sponsor by visiting their website, asimily.com. In your chat feature, you're going to find a quick message with the URL at the end. Again, that's the easiest way to get over and learn more about today's sponsor, asimily.com. A couple of reminders before we get started. I do want to ask everyone to save the date for our next MD Expo. It's going to be October 11 through 13. The MD Expo SoCal will be at the Pechanga Casino and Resort in Temecula, California. Save the dates and plan to register for this one-of-a-kind 3-day conference. Registration will open in June after the AMI Exchange. You can find more details and register online at mdexposhow.com. Okay, today's webinar, as always, is eligible for 1 CE credit from the ACI. You can obtain your CE certificate by completing the post-webinar survey. That survey will be emailed 1 hour after today's presentation. You must complete the survey to receive the certificate. If you have any issues, you can reach out to us directly at webinar@mdpublishing.com. As I mentioned earlier, Jeremy Linden and Robert Harbick will be our presenters for today. They will discuss similarities between traditional vulnerability scanning and IoMT passive network monitoring solutions. Jeremy, you may begin whenever you're ready.
Thanks, and thanks everyone for joining. My name is Jeremy Linden. I run product management here at Asimily. I have over 15 years of cybersecurity experience across both the network and the endpoint side. I've had the privilege of supporting a number of healthcare organizations on both the payer and the HDO side. And at Asimily, we build a full spectrum cybersecurity and asset management solution for those connected medical or IoMT devices, providing security all the way through pre-procurement risk assessments through to operations, vulnerability management, as I'll be talking about today, anomaly detection, monitoring for recalls, all the way through to utilization monitoring, capacity planning, and then procurement planning for replacement devices. I'm going to let Robert introduce himself as well.
Come on, guys.
Robert, you there?
Yes, I am. I'm just waiting for the system to unmute me.
We hear you now.
Okay, there we go. Much better. Jeremy, thank you very much for your introduction. It's very, very helpful to know all those things. I am a certified biomed technician and radiology equipment specialist. I've been doing this since 1980 as a field service engineer and also in-house guy all over the place. My background is one that serves the entire nation and parts of the world as well. I've been a biomed tech here within our local organization for approximately 20 years. I want to thank the opportunity to be here, part of this presentation. I think Jeremy's got some very exciting stuff, and I'm looking forward to being able to use it myself. Okay.
Great, thanks. So before I go into the meat of the presentation, I wanted to give a little bit of a background on some of the concepts and the terminology that we'll be using. So there's a lot of cybersecurity terminology that some of you may or may not know, but I think that the main thing that you need to understand is that an asset is something that has value and you want to protect. Vulnerabilities are weaknesses either in those assets or in other parts of the network or your other systems that could allow an attacker to compromise those assets, whether that has impacts across what we call the CIA triad. So that's confidentiality impacts, such as stealing data, integrity impacts like making the device's operations or the information contained inside untrustworthy, or availability impacts like having a device that actually is shut down or unable to provide patient care due to the attack. And then threats and the threat landscape are really what are all of the threats that have the potential to exploit vulnerabilities. So a threat involves both a attack vector, a way to get into a network, as well as some motivation, right? Whether that's financial, mischievous, or in some cases could be sort of nation state or geopolitical motivations. And then when we talk about risk is essentially the probability weighted likelihood of negative outcomes from those vulnerabilities. And then the process that we engage in of risk control is a way that we go and try to manage that risk. And there are multiple ways of doing that, including mitigations to the actual vulnerabilities themselves that could reduce or eliminate the likelihood that the vulnerability is actually exploited, or trying to reduce the severity or like the blast radius of an attack. So measures that would make an attack less likely to cause substantial damage if it does actually happen. To have a risk, you need to have assets, and those assets need to be vulnerable in some way, and then there must be an attacker who's actually interested in exploiting those vulnerabilities. When we apply controls, those are intended to reduce risk, but risk can never be fully eliminated. And you should know that a very motivated attacker generally will find their way in, and in many cases, your job is to be able to detect that compromise has occurred as quickly as possible and to prevent that compromise from causing any more damages, right? Because in the end, a attacker needs to find one thing that's wrong, and in many cases, the defender really needs to make sure that nothing is wrong. So it's inherently a lot easier to attack than it is to defend. So a lot of the processes that we go through are intended to make sure that we can get that upper hand through preparation. So to visualize it a bit, here's an asset. The asset is inside of a particular system or a device or a network. A threat is something that's trying to attack that asset. A vulnerability is sort of a way in, right? That's a way inside of that system, device, or network, some kind of a flaw. An attack vector is a way that you would actually exploit that vulnerability, and then an actual exploit is a weaponized piece of software or a weaponized technique that allows you to exploit that vulnerability. And then if that happens, that can cause an event. And then if that event actually causes some damage, then that's when it could sort of become an actual incident. And then all of this is considered part of the so-called threat landscape. So the adversaries, the tactics, the techniques, and the procedures that those adversaries use to attempt to compromise your assets. And then when we think about risk, we at Asimily and I think generally within the industry, risk is sort of a probability of an occurrence multiplied by a severity, right? So you can have a very high probability, low severity type attack, or you could have a very high severity but low probability attack, and in some cases those can actually be ultimately the same risk, right? Because risk is likelihood times impact.
Yes.
And then inside of cybersecurity, probability, we often think of that as what is the actual exploitability of that asset, and at Asimily we refer to that as the likelihood calculation. So I want to, so now that we've sort of talked about the landscape generally, I wanted to sort of talk about some of the more specific constraints that make the IoMT problem particularly difficult. Many of you would know these. So, of course, the medical device ecosystem is very complex. There's a lot of vendors, and then a lot of, there's a complex network of management, right? Not all, some devices are owned by the HDO and managed by the HDO. Some are owned by the HDO and managed by a third party, solutions organization, or some might be managed by the vendor themselves, or some might have overlapping and somewhat unclear management authorities between those people.
Mm-hmm.
It's often difficult to patch these medical devices. Updates may not be available, or if there is an OEM type update available, it might not be applicable. It might not be able to be applied, or it might actually void the warranty to apply it. And then that's sort of exacerbated by the fact that a lot of the systems that these devices use are very old. These devices are around for a very long time. Both after the HDO purchases them, they're often around for a long time, and often the same model of device is being sold for a long time without major improvements, because on some level, right, there's this sort of, well, if it's not broken, don't fix it. It's a very heavily regulated industry, and because of that, changing things has somewhat of a higher cost than it does through normal software or even normal hardware. So as a result, a lot of times you don't want to make major changes to these devices, which leads them to run systems that are legacy and often are very inherently quite vulnerable. There's not that much in the way of tooling. I mean, there are companies, obviously we are a company, but in general, compared to traditional IT infrastructure like laptops, desktops, and servers, which have had security products and solutions made for them for decades, IoMT specifically is newer, right? So there's just fewer tools that are really built specifically for either inventory, asset management, or security of these devices. And then some of the existing security solutions that organizations sometimes try to bolt on to these devices, such as active scanning, vulnerability management, or next generation anti-malware solutions that require agents, often aren't really compatible or can cause issues, which I'll talk about a bit later. Because of the lack of tools, you often just don't have enough visibility, right? You lack that accurate inventory. You may have that inside of a CMMS of some kind, or CMDB, but if that system isn't being updated manually, it often can be what I would say is worse than useless, right? Because it's not just wrong, it's misleading, and it can lead you to think something is true that really isn't. And then all of that, combined with these sort of technical and operational dependencies, the fact that these devices are often on proprietary vendor networks, they use non-traditional protocols, and have specific requirements there. So that just makes it more complicated to manage and secure. And then there are, in addition to sort of these technical gaps, there are also historical gaps in processes and how organizations have traditionally tried to solve this problem. There's often not a very well-defined process of pre-procurement or post-procurement assessments, intake, to try to make sure these devices are secure before they get on the network. Oftentimes, these assessments that are made are sort of ad hoc. They're not standardized. They can be dependent on a specific vendor. there can often be a bit of a who's on first type problem where no one really knows whose job it is, which of course means that it's really no one's job, because if it's everyone's job, it's really no one's job. And then, all of these processes can, in the way that they're implemented, can often make things very slow. And then that slowness can mean that there's a lot of pressure within the organization to speed things up, and that leads to cutting corners sometimes, because in the end, everything needs to be subservient to the core mission of providing patient care. And then fundamentally, and this is something that we at Asimily really see our mission being, to kind of provide a shared state of knowledge and a shared place to work off of between the disparate sort of the disparate groups that are often not very well connected to each other right now inside of an HDO. The HTM, clinical engineering side, the IT and cybersecurity side often just don't have, they often look at the world using very different paradigms and priorities. The IT side is often a lot more, risk oriented and process oriented. And then of course, the CE side is very clinically oriented, right? That's their mission. So they're, providing patient care is always going to take priority there. And, we really see our platform, that I'll talk about a bit more later, as really the way that these people can kind of come together and balance those needs against each other. So IoMT devices, they are a significant part of the organization's attack surface. That's because there are a lot of these devices. The average hospital room has a dozen connected devices, and then almost all those devices are inherently vulnerable, much more so than probably your typical laptops and servers, right? They may not be as prominent on the network. They may be socked away into a more hard to get to part of the network compared to your more traditional servers, but they are a lot more vulnerable than those servers. And the volume of threats really just keeps increasing, and a lot of these devices are still, unfortunately, pretty insecure. And then as hard as this problem is getting, it's really only getting harder. So between more devices, a higher percentage of those devices that you have connected to the network, and costs are only increasing. So there's really no better time than the present to up-level the risk mitigation program or put one in place if you don't have one. This is going to become, and is already becoming, a substantial, place that an attacker will go in to compromise a device, or if there is already a compromise, having these devices be insecure will make it a lot easier for an attack that might have been relatively contained to spread really out of control, like a wildfire, right? And then at that point, you have turned a potentially embarrassing or frustrating or irritating incident into one that could have incredibly serious or even life-threatening consequences if devices that are actually being currently deployed in the patient care environment start behaving abnormally or shut down. It can cause serious issues, and then the liability, of course, will only multiply substantially if anything actually ends up affecting patient care and actual health outcomes, as opposed to simply patient data. So now that I've given an overview of what the threat landscape looks like, I want to double click into the main topic of this talk, which is vulnerability management, and how to combine these different strategies for vulnerability management into your HDO's risk management program. So first, I want to talk about traditional vulnerability management. So this is the type of vulnerability management that you almost certainly have a program right now. Regulations generally are going to mean that there will be some kind of traditional vulnerability management program. Typically, it's going to be focused on the traditional IT infra. So laptops, desktops, and servers that are running pretty normal operating systems, Windows, Mac, Linux server operating systems. And this is roughly, this is how vulnerability management has worked for decades at this point. You basically have a vendor. These are vendors such as, you probably may have heard of them, Qualys or Tenable, Rapid7 are typically some of the larger vendors that we see. And what these guys do is they keep track of all of the vulnerabilities that are released for all of the platforms that they might see on a network. And then they will go and do a scan, like a port scan of the network. They will go and basically put out feelers, try to find machines. When they find those machines, which are typically represented by IP addresses on the network, they will go and scan those machines. They will try to fingerprint what kind of software those machines are running, both on the operating system as well as any applications that are network enabled that are on those devices, like web servers or file sharing servers. They will go and connect to those common ports. And then once they've figured out what they think the device is running, they will actually go and attempt to run the exploits against those devices. So they will basically use the same types of exploits that an actual attacker would use on a device, and they will of course try to make sure that they don't actually do any real damage, right? They're trying to create a condition where that exploit is able to succeed without actually, causing an issue that like they're not trying to be destructive. Typically, after an exploit, a real attacker will go and then deploy some kind of a payload, right? What they actually want to do, whether that's exfiltrating data or crashing the system or encrypting the files and locking them up. The VM vendor will do the exploit part, but then not the payload, right? Because they're not trying to actually cause damage. And then they will go and see, did the exploit succeed or not? And if the exploit succeeds, will then be able to say, well, because the exploit succeeded, that device is clearly vulnerable. Mm-hmm. So sounds great, right? That's very standard way of doing things. But in terms of IoMT, there are some issues. So first, not all vulnerabilities are exploitable in the same way as with traditional IT infrastructure. So IoMT devices, they generally don't behave in the same way as the type of infrastructure that a vulnerability management tool was designed for. They typically have a much more constrained operation, right? Because with a computer, right, if a web browser is vulnerable, I could go and, point my web browser at any website, right? And that any of those websites might have unknown code on there. And it's the responsibility of the browser to make sure that none of that code is malicious and can harm the system. So if there's a vulnerability in a web browser that allows a website to exploit or cause the browser to behave in a way that it shouldn't, for a traditional, laptop or something, that's really bad, right? Because you really don't know, there's no way to really tell a laptop only go to good sites, or at least there's no way to do it very easily. For an IoMT device, however, that web browser might be only used to access a specific thing, right? Like a specific control panel that's an internal control panel. Now that control panel, that may not have, it probably doesn't have the possibility of having malicious code on it because it's controlled, it's an internal web page. It's not really outside content. So that web browser, even if it's vulnerable in some kind of a platonic sense, it isn't really, that vulnerability doesn't actually pose a threat, right? Because even if that vulnerability, there's no way that vulnerability is going to actually be exploited in the real world operation of that device. So it's kind of what we would call an in-name only vulnerability. And the VM tool, because they're not built for IoMT, they don't really understand the nuances of how these different devices actually behave. And because of that, they will often use the wrong weighting to prioritize how severe vulnerabilities actually are. And then to add insult to injury, the active scanning that vulnerability management solutions do can actually cause issues with devices, even if those VM solutions aren't actually trying to cause any damage, right? Even if there's no real exploit payload necessarily, though these types of devices are often running on old software, old hardware, on versions of operating systems that have been really stripped down and designed to run on lower resource devices. And oftentimes, if they are being scanned actively, especially at the pace that a lot of these VM solutions will do, they won't be able to handle the load, and they won't be able to handle all of the unexpected network communications. So instead of being able to return a response that indicates that they are in fact vulnerable but not causing any problems, it can cause serious issues, right? Those devices could crash, they could just turn off, they could behave abnormally, they could reboot. All those things are bad, and this is actually something that we have run into with real customers in the past. Just a couple months ago, we were working with one of our HDO customers who thought they were actually under attack because they were noticing that a lot of their devices, that their infusion pumps were continuously rebooting, even when they were deployed in the patient care environment. So that's really not good, right? Those devices weren't really able to be functional in that environment because they were rebooting. So they called us and they wanted us to take a look and see what's going on because they thought they might be under attack. And we went and looked, and we did see a lot of scanning activity, which could indicate that there's an attack. But then when we actually ran it to ground, we discovered that the scanning that was causing those devices to crash was actually coming from inside the house, so to speak, right? It was an internal vulnerability management scanner that for some reason someone had added the IP network that these devices were on, probably someone in IT who just didn't understand all the nuances as I was talking about. They have a different paradigm for sort of looking at the world. So because of that, they didn't know. They configured this VM scanner to point to active devices, and because of that, they caused a patient care impact. Thankfully, not a super serious one, and one that we were able to figure out what was going on pretty quickly and get them to change. But you can obviously see how in a different situation, a different scenario, if you can't figure out what's going on, this could cause really serious issues.
Agreed. And
then there are other issues with traditional vulnerability management in terms of how traditional vulnerability management typically pushes you to work. It tends to be extremely focused on patching, which is important, and it's the gold standard. But a lot of these devices, they won't really ever receive patches. So, being myopically focused on patching is often not really what really makes that much sense. It often, because again, it doesn't really understand the way that these IoMT devices behave, it doesn't recommend some of these workarounds that might actually help, or it doesn't take those into account. Because in many cases, and this is one thing that we at Asimily really focus on, is mapping out workarounds that could either reduce or completely eliminate some of the risk through configuration changes, whether those are changes to the device's configuration or changes to the network's configuration, or behavioral changes, right? Like applying a more stringent physical access control to a device, or not performing certain not doing certain things with the device that cause it to be vulnerable. And then because of the vantage point that a vulnerability management scanner has, where it's doing active scanning, many of those fixes, they can't actually be detected that easily, because the vulnerability management scanner really only knows what it's able to get through scanning. And then the way that these vulnerabilities are prioritized is, again, based on that traditional IT paradigm, whereas really in the IoMT world, and this is something that we do, is that we really think that you need to prioritize based on the impact of the specific device in question, right? So a device that's keeping somebody alive is going to be more important than a device that just makes it a little bit easier for a doctor or a nurse to do their job. And vulnerability management scanners aren't going to know that, and of course they're not. That's not really their job. So because of that, they're only going to be able to prioritize using a single specific lens that isn't always the right lens to use. And you can kind of see the flow chart that we generally think of, internally, right? So patching if you can, if it's feasible, apply one. Otherwise, if you can't patch, try to mitigate the exploit vector in some way. And then if you can't really sufficiently mitigate it, then try to segment that device and reduce the blast radius by putting it in a part of the network that is contained and doesn't have the ability to reach out to everywhere else inside of the network. So if there is an attack and those devices do get compromised, the compromise doesn't spread uncontrolled within the organization. So I also want to talk about how passive network monitoring solutions work. So this is the kind of thing that we are, right? So Asimily is an example of a IoMT solution that's primarily based on passive network monitoring. So what we do is we deploy an edge. So that's basically a system that sits on the network and listens to devices, listens to the devices, to the network communications to and from those devices, does deep packet inspection to break open those devices' communications, and then is able to understand what those devices are actually doing. So, to do this, you typically need, at least one edge for each facility, right? Because you really want to be able to see all of what we would call east-west traffic, so traffic between devices, not just traffic that the devices send upstream to the internet. So, typically, you plug those devices into a span port on a switch or a router, or install a network tap of some kind, and then these devices will sit there and just listen to the network communication. And then when, through that deep packet inspection, we're able to detect a lot of information about the device. We're able to detect what kind of device it is. Is it an infusion pump? Is it an X-ray? What software version is actually being run, what protocols are being used, in many cases, even what procedures are being performed on those devices. And then all of those aspects are able to inform our understanding of what the vulnerabilities are on these devices. So in many cases, you don't actually need to try an exploit to know if a device is vulnerable. You can sort of see the way it's communicating. You can fingerprint the version it's using and then know it's a vulnerable version. Or you can see in some other way that the path to exploit a device is actually something that could be reached based on what you see the device sending. And then through that, you're able to infer that the device is in fact vulnerable or not, based on those attributes. And then you're also able to use that information to prioritize what devices are most important, right? So in addition to what devices are inherently more important, providing critical patient care stuff, you also can prioritize based on how frequently these devices are used, right? A device that's being used almost all the time is probably going to be more impactful if it gets compromised, all other things being equal, to a device that's only used 10% of the time. And then a device that is closer to other devices on the network, that device might be more impactful, because if that device is compromised, it could lead to compromises of the adjacent devices that it can communicate with. So these two approaches, they have really, they both have, pluses and minuses, right? In many ways, a active scanner is going to be very good at detecting a lot of vulnerabilities. Not passive network monitoring is not always able to detect at as high of a degree of accuracy, because it's not able to do any active scanning. It really depends on the specific device and the specific vulnerability, but it can be easier sometimes with active scanning. But passive monitoring is less invasive, less intensive. It causes a lot fewer impacts. It's a lot less concerning from just an operations standpoint. And it can also be faster because of the fact that scanning just is more intensive, and you can't scan your entire network probably every single day or every single hour because it's just too big. And then the IoMT specific monitoring solution will usually have both better prioritization as well as better recommendations because it's much more tailored to the specific needs of the IoMT use case. So we are able to basically combine these approaches. So at Asimily, we integrate with the major vulnerability management providers, and we will essentially take what we are able to discern from passive monitoring and then call on the active scanner to get information about things that we might not be able to as easily. So we can pull in the detected vulnerabilities from the active scanner and then prioritize them using our own prioritization rubric and our own recommendation rubric, which are usually going to be a lot better than what you'd see inside of a vulnerability management solution that's not designed for IoMT. So if you do this, you should keep some things in mind. So don't run active scans during on devices that are in use. As the example I gave before illustrated, there are lots of reasons why you shouldn't be doing that. So either make sure that you take them out of service before before that's run, or consider just running them during the off hours if you're not a 24/7 operation. And you can run it over the weekend or overnight. That obviously is going to have a lot less impact than running it while a device is in use. And then, in many cases, you might not be able to, or it might not be worth it to scan every single IoMT device. So you can often use a passive solution like us to narrow down what which scan targets are most important by potential risk or potential impact, right? So you could prioritize the most impactful devices or the devices that you know of that are more likely to be vulnerable, or you can take sort of that probability weighted approach that I talked about earlier and prioritize by our likelihood of exploitation. So I want to give some examples of just like what this actually looks like inside of a customer environment. So here's an architecture. Here's how you can see what the architecture would look like if you have a VM solution and a passive network monitoring solution like us. So on the right, you can see all the customer sites. All these devices are on the customer sites. The routers roll back through to a gateway, and then that gateway is plugged into our packet processors, our edges, and then we are basically fetching all the network traffic, and then we're analyzing that traffic as it goes through the gateway from the customer sites. And then those edges are going to send information out to our portal, which is in the cloud. So our head, this is the system that that you'd actually log into. Important to note that it doesn't contain any PHI or anything like that. So it's not actually the edge. So all that stays on the network. And then the edges are just sending the conclusions that it reaches. So, I found out that this device does this thing. So then the portal will then aggregate that and then provide the risk mitigation. Then the portal in turn will communicate with a collector that is deployed on the network that is integrated with the vulnerability management solution. That vulnerability management solution is going to perform its regular scans, and then we'll fetch, our collector will then fetch information from the vulnerability management solution based on the scans and the vulnerabilities that have been detected in those scans. The collector will send that information back up to the portal and then provide a consolidated view. And that's kind of what this view looks like. You can see here, right, we're able to sort of look at specific devices and specific vulnerabilities and sort of say, okay, what are the number of devices that are impacted by these vulnerabilities? Is there a recommendation that you could apply? What's the status of that recommendation? Has it been applied? And then you can kind of see here, these are the types of recommendations. So in many cases, they're like behavioral changes. or their updates. They can also be network configuration changes. So we'll basically aggregate all the information from both the vulnerability management solution as well as our own analysis, and then provide it in a single pane of glass that you can have here, and use that as a one-stop shop to identify, prioritize, and then remediate the vulnerabilities that that have been detected. So Bob's going to talk about what this actually looks like in practice and what his day-to-day is like.
Hey guys, Bob Harbick here, biomedical technician over at Southcoast Health. We typically take a look at the last 24 to 48 hours of anomalies and events and reconcile them with the ownership and activity. The questions that we ask are any of these against policy? And who owns the device and which group internally is responsible? Special attention is often given to the guest network and recently seen devices. If there is any suspicious or policy violating activity, we can easily quarantine the device or bounce it off of the network. And we check the recall list to determine if any new recalls impact the device or the device fleet. This is important because we can see things that happen, most especially recently. You can take a look and you're going to find that there were a lot of things that were happening. I have a list of items here, just taking a look at common information with Internet of Things stuff. You know, we've got almost everything in our house here being affected by those things. And we've gone through after a couple of months and decided that these are very limited capability and some have a great deal. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next slide. For each device, determine who owns it. Is it IT? Is it clinical engineering? Is it someone else out there? Is it medical devices? These are the things that we have to take a look at very closely and ask those questions, you know, who owns it? If it's an IT device, you know, certainly we don't want to affect that until we get their permission to do so. If it's our stuff, they're going to wait until we do something with it before they try to wade in and actually do stuff. Clinical engineering has its purpose out there, and if it's overstepped, unfortunately, it means that clinical health is going to be affected also. We use Asimily's likelihood prioritization to prioritize vulnerabilities across all Internet of Medical technology. And we try to do the same thing on all of our devices. That's a very difficult process because sometimes the technology that we have out there is based on Windows. Sometimes it's based on something much, much lower, such as infusion pumps that are running on that kind of technology out there, which is not Windows at all, but something else. We utilize both patching and Asimily workaround recommendations to remediate, mitigate, affected devices. As Jeremy said, there are some things going on in the background where the network is being tested on a non-routine basis by some outside sources to actually try to break things and to see whether or not that is a possible inflow. And the good news is that for the most part, that goes without any big problems for us. There are some advantages to isolating things down to a single network and a single communication protocol. There are some also larger advantages to opening things up. The bad news with the large one is that vulnerability gets passed on to everyone, and the bad news for the small network is they don't necessarily talk to each other. Okay, next up. Some of the results that we're going to see on a weekly to monthly basis. For the last few months, we've been keeping track of the number of devices that are actually connected to the network. As you can see, the blue line is actually the number of devices that are connected to the network. The orange, green, and red lines are actually the ones that keep track of the ones that are actually talking to each other. We had a point earlier this year where we had a large number of devices on the network, but very few were actually talking to anything else. What's happened here is over the last couple of weeks, these devices have begun talking to each other and their data receivers, and this has caused an issue. However, in order to keep patient care as positive as possible, we see these things happening, and we have to ask the question, is this happening in any kind of secure network, or is this something happening that we have to make sure that this doesn't happen again? For the most part, the devices that are talking right now are going to be infusion pumps, and the infusion pumps live on a very separate network from everything else. And the good news is, although it may be sharing information with a specific, on a specific case, it's not necessarily doing anything that's going to share across the network in general. Next slide, please. Oops.
So I wanted to, so I wanted to give some final thoughts. First, I think it's really, interesting if you look at this graph, right? I think it really does show that vulnerability management is sort of a continuous process, right? Because you can see the total fixed, right? You can see, and you can see how, they started at one point, the vulnerabilities, have been going down as you see the fixed line go up. But, the beginning of the month, there were some new vulnerabilities released, some other devices, changed because they became vulnerable again because they're from a different vulnerability. So it's a continuous process. You're never going to be done because new vulnerabilities are always going to be released. And that's really why, we call it vulnerability management, right? Because it's managing the vulnerabilities to a steady state. What you don't want to see is that the graph just going up and to the right, continuously. Then you have a real problem where vulnerabilities are growing unbounded.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, to summarize, I think it's important to understand the differences, the benefits between active and passive approaches to vulnerability detection and management for IoMT. Active scans can provide useful data, but they, definitely shouldn't be used as the primary source of vulnerability data or the primary thing that you're relying on in your IoMT vulnerability management program. And if you do choose to integrate active scanning into your IoMT program, just be careful. Unintended consequences can happen. Those can cause serious impacts. So take some of the precautions that I mentioned earlier.
Absolutely.
So if there's if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And if you want to know more about Asimily or about anything that I've talked about today, this is my email. So please feel free to shoot me an email at any time.
Jeremy, thanks so much. We do have a couple of questions. I see we've got about 10 minutes before we hit the 60-minute mark. So I'm going to jump right in and ask a couple of questions to you and Robert. Feel free to chime in. First question, if I'm not already running active scans on my IoMT devices, should we be doing that in addition to passive network monitoring?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, and that's actually something that we get asked all the time from our HDO customers. Honestly, I go back and forth on this sometimes. I would say, in general, if you're already happy with how your vulnerability management program is working, I probably wouldn't add active scanning, to be perfectly honest. Just because I think it really can cause issues, and in many cases, the juice isn't worth the squeeze, so to speak. I mean, can you get an active scanning program set up that's going to not mess around with anything and it's not going to cause any issues? Absolutely, but it does take some work, and I'm just not sure that the relatively incremental benefit is worth it. That being said, if you do feel like there's a gap, I think it does make sense to do, as long as you just treat it with some caution.
Mm-hmm.
Fair enough. Another attendee has asked, how can a solution like Asimily help us implement some of these mitigation measures, reduce the risk of vulnerabilities?
Yeah. So what we do, you saw the recommendations that we provide. I mean, that's already something that we really pride ourselves on. A lot of vendors in this market are very focused on either patching or segmentation only. We also integrate with, a lot of the enforcement solutions that are already present inside of your organization. Solutions from vendors like Cisco, Juniper, Aruba. We're able to integrate with those solutions. And in many cases, if the mitigation is a network mitigation, we can often apply that recommendation directly from the Asimily Insight console, right? So if you have a recommendation, it says, turn off, don't allow, turn off RDP on this device. We could actually integrate with your Cisco ICE solution and say, okay, for this device, don't allow any RDP requests into that device. And then you can mitigate the vulnerability that way. So, that's really a single pane of glass experience where you're inside of the product, you're basically seeing a recommendation, you're applying the recommendation, and then you can basically close it out inside of the solution and then mark it as fixed.
Absolutely.
All right. Looks like we've got time for a couple of more questions. I got two teed up, but I do want to remind attendees, if you had a last moment question or something's come to mind, you can use that question feature on your webinar dashboard. Next question, is segmentation a good solution for IoMT vulnerability management?
Yeah, I kind of mentioned this before. I think a lot of vendors really do focus on segmentation, and I do think that segmentation is a worthwhile thing to do in many cases. Don't get me wrong, but I think sometimes vendors are overly focused on segmentation and that they're selling segmentation projects to HDOs as a way, in some cases, as a lot of these service organizations will help you build segmentation. Because segmentation is such an intensive and such a long process, a lot of these service organizations are very excited to sell you more segmentation because it means a lot more contractor hours for them. In the end, segmentation at best will reduce the blast radius of an attack, right? It's going to mean that a successful attack is a lot less successful than it would be. And that's very important, but it's not a substitute for actually remediating the specific issues, right? And actually reducing the inherent risk and the likelihood of exploitation of these vulnerabilities. So I would say, some segmentation, good. A segment the world approach is kind of like a boil the ocean type strategy that just doesn't really, I've almost never seen it operationalized successfully because of the intensive labor required in setting it up. And then once you've set it up, the amount of work required to make to continuously, keep it up to date, right? It's just another thing that you're going to have to keep track of constantly.
All right, looks like we can get through one more question. This attendee would like to know, who do you think is best positioned to assess and manage a tool like Asimily when used with medical devices? Would it be the IT? Could it be clinical engineering? What type of skill set does that individual require?
I think in the end, it really does have to be a shared responsibility, because both of these groups, they bring different strengths and weaknesses and different lenses of knowledge. So I think that the IT side needs to be informed by the prioritization and the unique needs of the clinical environment. I think I see way too many IT teams that just have a very kind of rigid sort of blinders-based approach to implementing these recommendations, or to doing everything, and it really causes a lot of pain. So I think you absolutely need both sides. I would say probably what I see the most successful organizations doing is having IT be the primary owner, with a lot of input coming from the HTM CE side, especially as it comes to prioritization. I have also seen it work okay the other way, where CE has the primary ownership. Typically, that would involve someone on the CE staff, or either one or a small group of people that have a bit more IT and security background than your typical biomedical engineer would have. So if that's something, as a biomed that you're interested in, I think learning that skill will make the HTM side a lot more capable of picking up that responsibility if it's something that you do choose to take on.
Fantastic, guys. I appreciate your time today. Certainly a great presentation by both of you. Again, I do want to encourage the attendees to go and visit today's sponsor to learn more about the products and services provided to the HTM industry. You can learn more about Asimily by visiting their website, asimily.com. A last reminder to the attendees that you can obtain your CE certificate by completing the post-webinar survey. This survey will be emailed 1 hour after now. You must complete the survey to receive the CE certificate. You'll be able to download that certificate from your computer. If you have any questions or issues, do reach out to us at webinar@MD Publishing. We're going to be back next week with another great webinar. If you want to go ahead and register for it and following webinars, you can do so by visiting webinarwednesday.live. All right, guys, Technation community, make it a great Wednesday. Have an awesome week. We'll see you back real soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanking you.